No one wanted to take care of the paralyzed billionaire until the maid's Toddler stepped in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a story that might change the way you see loyalty, power, and truth. Before we begin, take 1 second to support stories like this. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our growing family. And I'm really curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you in New York, Jamaica, South Africa, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's begin. The room was completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace. The kind that comes right before something breaks. Ashford sat in his wheelchair near the tall window of his study, the same window he'd sat beside every single morning for 2 years. His hands were folded in his lap, the way they always were. Still. Unmoving. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on something outside that no one else could see. And then the door creaked open. Nobody ever came into this room without knocking first. That was the rule. One of 37 rules posted on a laminated sheet outside his study door. Rules that every caregiver, every housekeeper, every hired professional had memorized and followed until they couldn't anymore. Until they quit. But this time there was no knock. Just the soft, wet padding of tiny bare feet on hardwood floor. Ashford didn't turn around. His body tensed. You could see it in the way his shoulders climbed half an inch toward his ears. His breathing changed. And then a small voice, no more than 3 years old, round and warm and completely fearless, said, "You sad?" The question hung in the air like something holy. Ashford's hands, which had been folded so carefully, so deliberately still, trembled once. Just once. He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. His throat moved like he was trying to swallow something sharp. The little girl didn't wait for a response. She walked around the side of the wheelchair, dragging a worn stuffed rabbit behind her, and stood right in front of him. She tilted her head, blinked her big dark eyes. And then, without asking permission, without hesitating for even a second, she climbed up onto the footrest of his wheelchair, grabbed his frozen hand in both of hers, and held it. She just held it. And Ashford Crane, the man who had built a $4.2 billion company from nothing, the man who had fired 12 caregivers in 22 months, the man who had not cried once since the accident, felt something in his chest crack open like old wood in the cold. How did a 3-year-old do what no doctor, no therapist, no hired professional could do in 2 years? That's the question this story is going to answer. But first, you need to understand what this house felt like before she walked into it. Nobody wanted the job. That's not an exaggeration. The staffing agency that handled Ashford's estate had placed him on what they internally called the red list. That meant difficult client, unpredictable environment, high turnover guaranteed, 12 caregivers in 22 months. Some lasted 3 weeks. One lasted 4 days. One, a seasoned professional with 18 years of experience, walked out on her second morning without a single word, left her badge on the kitchen counter, and never called back. Nobody explained why. Nobody had to. The house itself seemed to exhale something cold. Even in summer, when the gardens outside were full and green, the inside of Ashford Crane's estate felt like a place where warmth came to die. And yet, Laura Chin had shown up with a mop bucket and a sleeping toddler strapped to her chest. She had no other option. Her babysitter had canceled that morning, the 3rd time in 2 weeks, and she could not afford to miss a single shift. So she had done what single mothers have been doing quietly since the beginning of time. She figured it out. She brought Lena with her. She would keep her in the supply closet turned break room near the kitchen. She would handle it. She always handled it. She did not know, on that first morning, that Lena would change everything. She did not know that a 3-year-old with a stuffed rabbit and no concept of fear would walk through a closed door and do something that a team of professionals could not. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before that moment, before the hand-holding, before the cracked open chest, before any of it. There were two very lonely people living under the same roof, moving in completely separate worlds, never once truly seeing each other. That's where this story really begins. Laura's alarm went off at 4:47 every morning. Not 4:45. Not 5 o'clock. 4:47, because that was exactly how much time she needed. 14 minutes to get dressed without waking Lena. 6 minutes to make a bottle and pack the diaper bag. 12 minutes to drive to the estate if she hit every light green, which she never did. She had calculated the margin down to the minute, and she lived inside it every single day. The apartment she rented was a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled permanently of someone else's cooking. She slept on the pull-out sofa, so Lena could have the bedroom. The mattress had a spring that dug into her left shoulder blade, and she had stopped noticing it 3 months ago, which she understood was not a good sign. She didn't talk about being tired. There was no one to tell. Lena's father had been gone since before Lena was born. Not dead, just gone. The kind of gone that leaves no forwarding address and no explanation. Laura had spent approximately 2 weeks being angry about it, and then she had stopped because anger costs energy, and energy was the one thing she could not afford to waste. She cleaned houses for a living. Had since she was 19. She was good at it, thorough, quiet, invisible in the way that good house staff learn to be.
She did not take things.
She did not snoop. She did not make herself a presence in any space that wasn't hers. The Crane estate was her largest account. It paid 3 times what her other jobs paid, which is the only reason she was still there after 2 months. That and stubbornness. Laura was profoundly stubborn. She considered it her finest quality. She cleaned the East Wing on Mondays and Thursdays. She cleaned the West Wing on Tuesdays and Fridays. She did not clean the study. Nobody cleaned the study. That was on the laminated list. She saw Ashford rarely. Sometimes she heard the soft electric hum of his wheelchair moving down a hallway before she saw him. She would step to the side, keep her eyes down, keep moving. He never spoke to her. She never spoke to him. That was the arrangement, and it suited them both. On the other side of the house, Ashford Crane existed. That's the only honest word for it. He didn't live. He existed. He moved through the rooms of his own home like a man walking through a museum of his former life, observing everything, touching nothing, belonging nowhere. He had been paralyzed from the waist down for 2 years and 3 months. The accident had been a car crash on a Tuesday evening in November, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that gives no warning before it splits a life in two. He had been driving home from a board meeting. A truck ran a red light. That was all. A truck, a red light, a Tuesday. And then the version of Ashford Crane who could walk, who could run, who had climbed every floor of his office building on foot because he hated waiting for the elevator. That version was simply gone. The new version was quieter. Colder. He had fired his first caregiver for hovering. His second for speaking to him in a slow, soft voice the way people speak to children and the very old. His third for rearranging the items on his desk without permission. The reasons became smaller as the months passed. He knew this. He understood on some clinical level that he was pushing people away before they could leave on their own. He could not seem to stop. His physical therapist visited on Wednesdays. His doctor on the first Monday of every month. His attorney called every week, and they discussed business because that was the only language Ashford still trusted. He had not seen a friend, a real one, in over a year. He told himself this was by choice. He sat by the window every morning with a cup of coffee that went cold while he stared at the garden. He had loved that garden once. He had planted 3 of the rose bushes himself, years ago, before he thought such things needed remembering. He did not go outside anymore. Some mornings the silence in the house was so complete that he could hear the hum of the refrigerator from 2 rooms away. He had noticed this. He had noted it with the same distant precision with which he now catalogued most things, like data points in a life he was observing rather than living. On a Wednesday morning in late March, Laura arrived at 6:02, 2 minutes late, A green light she'd miscounted, and Ashford heard her key in the lock from all the way down the hall. He said nothing. He wrapped both hands around his cold coffee cup and stared at the garden, and the silence resumed, and the two of them moved through the house like parallel lines that would never meet. That was the day Lena woke up early. Lena was 3 years and 2 months old, and she approached the world with the complete confidence of someone who had never once been told that most of it was off-limits. She had dark curly hair that resisted every attempt to contain it. She carried a stuffed rabbit named, simply, Rabbit. She spoke in short, certain sentences and expected to be understood. She was not afraid of strangers. She was not afraid of quiet. She was not, as it turned out, afraid of Ashford Crane. The first time she saw him, she was supposed to be asleep on the folded blanket Laura had arranged for her in the break room. But Lena had never been much for supposed to. She had pushed the door open. Toddlers always find the unlatched doors, and wandered down the east hallway in her socks, dragging Rabbit by one ear. She found Ashford in the sunroom. He was reading or holding a book, at least. She walked right up to his wheelchair and stared at it with open curiosity, the way children examine things that adults have learned to pretend not to notice. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the wheel. Ashford looked at her over the top of his book. His expression was the face of a man who had not been spoken to by a child in a very long time and could not immediately locate the correct response. "A wheelchair," he said finally. She nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then she climbed up onto the ottoman next to him, just climbed right up, without asking, and sat there with Rabbit in her lap, looking out the same window he was looking out. They sat like that for 4 minutes. Laura found her on the 5th and scooped her up with a flood of whispered apologies, her face flushed red. Ashford said nothing. He looked back at his book. But that evening his coffee didn't go cold. The second time happened 3 days later. Laura had brought Lena again. The babysitter situation had not improved, and this time Lena made it all the way to the study door before Laura caught her. She stood in the hallway, one hand on the wall, peering at the closed door. "Man in there?" she asked. "Yes," Laura whispered. "But we don't go in there." "Come on." "He's sad?" Laura paused. She looked at the closed door. She didn't know how to answer that. "Come on, baby," she said. But the question stayed with her the rest of the day. The third time was the morning that changed the shape of things. Lena had developed a habit of bringing Ashford objects. A crayon. A cracker she decided she didn't want. A drawing she'd made on the back of a paper bag. 2 circles and some lines that she informed him was you and me and Rabbit. She delivered each item with the gravity of a diplomat presenting credentials, then retreated to a safe distance to watch his reaction. He never smiled. But he also never told her to go away. He kept the drawing. Laura noticed it, pinned to the small corkboard above his desk, on a Thursday when she was cleaning the hallway and the study door had been left 3 inches open. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have, looking at those 2 wobbly circles and their stick arms.
She didn't say anything.
She went back to her mop and her bucket and her route. But something in her chest felt different for the rest of the afternoon. Lighter, maybe. Or just less alone. Lena started calling him Ash. Not Mr. Crane. Not Sir.
Ash.
She had heard Laura say his name once, and had kept the part she liked. He never corrected her. After the 3rd or 4th time, he stopped flinching when she said it. That was, if you were paying close attention, enormous. Laura found the photograph by accident. She was cleaning the hallway shelf, the long one near the east staircase that nobody used anymore, and she moved a small ceramic bowl to dust beneath it, and underneath the bowl was a photograph that must have slid off the shelf and been covered for months. A wedding photo. Ashford, younger by maybe 5 years, standing straight and tall and laughing, actually laughing, teeth and everything, beside a woman in a white dress. The woman was beautiful. Dark hair, bright eyes, one hand on Ashford's chest like she was steadying herself from laughing too hard. Laura set the photograph back exactly where she'd found it, under the bowl. She told no one. But she thought about that laughing version of him for the rest of the week. She thought about the distance between the man in that photograph and the man who now sat beside a window every morning, not drinking his coffee. She mentioned it once, carefully, to Mrs. Patton, the estate's part-time cook, 61 years old, who had worked for the Crane family for longer than anyone else and had somehow survived every wave of staff turnover by being indispensable and invisible in equal measure. Mrs. Patton didn't look up from her cutting board. Her name was Claire, she said. She died 14 months before the accident. Laura stood very still. Cancer, Mrs. Patton added. 19 months from diagnosis to end. He was with her every day. She said nothing else. She kept cutting. Laura understood that the conversation was over. That night, putting Lena to bed, Laura held her daughter a few seconds longer than usual. Lena, half asleep, patted Laura's cheek with one small hand. "Mama tired?"
A little, Laura said.
"Sockeye," Lena murmured. "I hear." Laura kissed her forehead and sat in the dark for a long time after. She started to see the house differently after that. The garden he never visited. Claire had designed it, Mrs. Patton told her one morning without being asked, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment. The rose bushes. The stone bench near the fountain that had a small plaque on it that Laura had never let herself read closely enough to make out the words. The way Ashford always sat with his chair angled very slightly away from the garden window, not fully facing it but not fully turned away either. The way he never played music, though there was an expensive speaker system in every room.
He was not simply a difficult man.
He was a man who had lost his wife to cancer and then lost the use of his legs on an ordinary Tuesday, and he had run out of ways to carry it. Laura understood, on a cellular level, what it meant to carry more than you had the hands for. She did not say this to him.
She would not have known how.
But she stopped looking at the floor when she passed him in the hallway. It was a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday when the letter arrived. Laura found it on the kitchen counter when she arrived, because Mrs. Patton had left it there deliberately, propped against the fruit bowl where Laura would see it. It was from the staffing agency, addressed to Ashford. But Mrs. Patton, who had worked in that house for 19 years and believed firmly in transparency when it served the household's well-being, had already opened it and read it and left it for Laura to read also. The agency was withdrawing from the account. Formal language, professional language, but the meaning was clear. They would no longer be sourcing caregivers for Mr. Ashford Crane. The liability had become untenable. The turnover rate was unacceptable. They wished him well in finding alternative support. Laura read it twice. She set it back against the fruit bowl. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, looking out the window at the garden, at the rose bushes, at the stone bench with a plaque she'd never read. She thought about her rent, about the spring in the sofa mattress, about Lena's shoes, which were already a size too small and had been for 3 weeks. She thought about the drawing on his corkboard, 2 circles and some lines. Then she picked up her mop and started her route. She didn't tell him she'd seen the letter. She didn't have to. By Thursday, there was a stiffness in the house that hadn't been there before, a new layer of quiet on top of the existing quiet, the way ice forms over water that was already cold. Mrs. Patton moved carefully. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder. Ashford said nothing to anyone. But on Friday morning, Laura arrived to find that he had not moved from the study since the previous day. His dinner tray, which Mrs. Patton had left outside the door Thursday evening, was still there, untouched. Laura looked at the tray. She looked at the closed door. She knocked. No response. She knocked again. "Mr. Crane, I'm going to take the tray." Silence. She picked up the tray. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. That afternoon, Lena escaped the break room again. And this time, Laura let her. The next 2 weeks were the hardest. Without the agency, the question of Ashford's care became urgent in a way that could no longer be quietly managed. His doctor, Dr. Reyes, a careful, serious man in his 50s who had been Ashford's physician for 6 years, came by on a Monday unannounced and had a conversation with Mrs. Patton that Laura was not supposed to hear but did, because the kitchen acoustics were what they were. The words isolation, deterioration, and cannot continue like this came through the wall clearly enough. Dr. Reyes left a list of in-home care facilities. Mrs. Patton set it on the counter next to the fruit bowl. Neither of them said anything to Ashford. Neither of them knew how. Laura started arriving earlier. She told herself it was about the route. More time to do a thorough clean before Lena woke up and needed managing. That was true enough. But she also started leaving small things. A fresh cup of coffee outside the study door in the morning, not because anyone asked her to, but because she knew Mrs. Patton's knees hurt in the morning, and because she knew the coffee sat cold otherwise.
She didn't knock.
She didn't announce it. She just left it there. The first morning, it was still there when she came back past at 9. The second morning, it was gone. She didn't let herself think too much about that. Lena, meanwhile, had developed a full and independent relationship with Ashford that operated entirely outside of Laura's knowledge or control. She visited him in the mornings while Laura was in the West Wing. She had learned, somehow, that she needed to be quiet in the hallway. She crept along the wall in her socks with theatrical seriousness, as though she were on a mission of great importance, which in her mind she absolutely was. She always brought something. A cracker. A flower she'd pulled from the arrangement in the foyer. A piece of tape she'd found on the floor and considered precious. One morning, she brought him a bandage. She had found it in the bathroom cabinet. The children's kind, with cartoon stars on it, and she pressed it very carefully onto the back of his hand with both her palms, smoothing it down firmly the way she'd seen Laura do when Lena had a scrape.
There, she said.
All better. Ashford looked at the cartoon bandage on his hand for a very long time. Thank you, Lena, he said. It was the first time he had said her name. She beamed at him with her whole face and ran back down the hallway, and he sat with that bandage on his hand for the rest of the day and did not take it off. But the pressure kept building. Laura overheard a phone call. Ashford's attorney, Marcus Webb, a sharp-voiced man in his 40s who called every Thursday at 10. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was in the hallway. The study door was cracked. Ashford, the board is asking questions. You haven't been on a call in 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
If you don't. She moved away.
Fast.
Kept her head down. But her stomach was tight for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, she sat on her sofa mattress with the spring in it and looked at her phone. At her bank balance. At the number. She thought about what it would mean to lose this job. She thought about Lena, asleep in the next room, hugging Rabbit. She didn't sleep well. It was Mrs. Patton who finally said what no one had been saying. On a Thursday morning, she set a plate of toast on the kitchen table, sat down across from Laura, and said, "He asked about the little one." Laura looked up, asked me her name, how old she was. Mrs. Patton picked up her tea. He's never asked about staff before. Not once in 19 years. Laura didn't know what to say. I'm just telling you, Mrs. Patton said. And she drank her tea. That same afternoon, Laura was mopping the east hallway when she heard it. Laughter. Not a lot of it. Not loud. A short, low sound, quickly swallowed, the kind that escapes before a person can catch it. She stopped mopping. Stood completely still. From inside the study, Lena's voice, telling a story about Rabbit and a dragon and some crackers. And then, again, that brief, low sound. Ashford Crane. Laughing. Laura pressed her back against the wall. She stayed there for a full minute, eyes closed. Then there was the morning she arrived, and the study door was open. All the way open. Not 3 inches. Wide open. Ashford was at his desk. Actually at his desk, not at the window, with papers spread out in front of him. He was working. He looked up when she came around the corner. They looked at each other.
Good morning, he said.
Laura blinked. Good morning, Mr. Crane. He looked back at his papers. She continued down the hall. She turned the corner and stood against the wall with her hand over her mouth for 10 seconds before she could keep moving. And then came the morning. Everything almost fell apart. Laura arrived at 6:04, traffic, and Lena, who had been increasingly impossible to keep in the break room, had gotten out before Laura even had her coat off. By the time Laura realized, Lena was gone. She found her in the garden. Outside. In the garden. Standing at the stone bench by the fountain, looking at the small plaque on it. And Ashford was there too. His wheelchair was on the path, outside in the March air, the first time in over a year that he had been in that garden. He was very still. He was looking at the bench, at the plaque, at Lena, who was standing next to it with her hand resting lightly on the stone. Laura stopped at the garden door.
She didn't go out.
She didn't call Lena's name. She watched from behind the glass and held her breath. Lena couldn't read. She was 3. She didn't know what the words on the plaque said. She didn't know whose name was carved into that stone, or what the dates beneath it meant, or why the bench sat facing the rose bushes the way it did. She just knew that the man who came to sit by the window every morning, the man she called Ash, was looking at that bench the way her mama sometimes looked at the phone when a number didn't call back, like waiting for something that wasn't coming. She walked over to his wheelchair and stood beside it, the way she always did. Rabbit dangled from her hand. The morning air was cold enough that her breath made small clouds. She looked at the bench. She looked at him. "Who's that?" she asked, pointing at the plaque. Ashford was quiet for a long time. Long enough that a grown adult would have moved on, changed the subject, filled the silence with something easier. Lena waited. "Her name was Claire," he said finally. "She sleep there?"
No.
His voice was very careful. "She just liked the spot. So I put her name here." Lena considered this. Nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone receiving important information. Then she said, "You miss her?" The question was so direct, so clean, so utterly without armor that Ashford had no defense against it. There was no boardroom answer for it. No attorney's language. No way to fold it up and set it aside. He looked at this 3-year-old with her stuffed rabbit and her mismatched socks, one green, one white, and he said, very quietly, "Every day." Lena reached up and took his hand, both of hers around one of his, same as the day in the study, same as always. Like it was simply the right thing to do, and no one had told her otherwise yet. "Sockeye," she said. "I hear." The same words she said to Laura in the dark. "Sockeye, I hear." And Ashford Crane, who had fired 12 caregivers, who had not laughed in 2 years, who had not come into this garden since his wife's name had been carved into that stone, put his other hand on top of Lena's small ones, and he pressed his eyes closed, and his whole body shook once, quietly, like a tree in a wind you can barely feel. Laura, behind the glass, covered her mouth. She was crying before she realized it. Silent tears, the kind that surprise you. She didn't go out. This moment was not hers to enter. It belonged to a little girl with a stuffed rabbit and no understanding of impossibility, who had walked into a closed-off life and simply refused to leave it closed. They stayed like that for a long time. The man in the wheelchair and the toddler with both her hands around his, standing beside the bench with a name on it, in the garden with the rose bushes, in the cold March morning air. Nobody needed to say anything else. The garden door started being unlocked in the mornings. Laura noticed it on a Monday. The handle was unlatched when she arrived, and the curtains on the garden-facing windows had been pulled back. Not all the way, just enough to let the light in. She didn't mention it. She just cleaned around the extra light. The dining room table was set for breakfast on a Wednesday. Not the tray outside the study, the actual table in the actual dining room. Mrs. Patton didn't say anything about it, but she made extra toast and set out 3 place settings without being asked. Ashford ate at the table that morning. Lena ate beside him, because Lena always sat wherever she decided to sit, and she had decided the chair to Ashford's left was hers. She ate half a piece of toast and gave the other half to Rabbit, who she propped against the water glass. Ashford watched this solemn offering to the stuffed rabbit with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite not one. The papers on his desk started having answers on them. Laura could see them through the open study door, the door that was now consistently left open, and she could see that he was working again. Real work. Not the hollow performance of holding documents. Actual engagement. Phone calls through the speaker on his desk, his voice back to something that sounded like the man in the wedding photograph. Not fully.
Not yet.
But the direction had changed. Dr. Reyes visited on a Friday and came out of the study looking uncertain in a new way. Uncertain because things were better, and he hadn't expected that, and he didn't know quite what to do with good news after so long. He stopped Laura in the hallway. "What changed?" he asked. Laura thought about it for a moment. "Ask Lena," she said. The coffee outside the study door stopped. Because now there was coffee at the dining table. And sometimes there was a second cup, set at the opposite end, because Mrs. Patton had started doing that and Laura had started sitting in that chair for the 11 minutes between finishing the East Wing and starting the West, drinking her coffee while Lena sat with Ashford and told him whatever she needed to tell him that morning. He always listened. He always, Laura noticed, had a little more space in his face after. There's a kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come from the right therapist or the right medication or the right turning point in a well-structured plan. Sometimes it comes from a 3-year-old in mismatched socks who has not yet learned that some people are too broken to reach. She just reaches anyway. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone you love who's been closed off, or someone who reached for you when you didn't have the words to ask them to, then this channel is for you. We tell these stories because they matter. Because the quiet moments, the bandage with cartoon stars, the drawing of 2 circles, the small hand wrapped around a larger one by a stone bench, those are the moments that change lives. And they almost never make the news. If you believe in stories like this, subscribe. Leave a comment about a moment when someone small surprised you with their kindness. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We don't shout here. We don't chase trends. We just sit with the stories that are worth staying for. And there are so many more worth staying for. A few months later, in early summer, the garden came back to life. The rose bushes bloomed the way they apparently had every year before the years when no one was watching. Mrs. Patton cut 3 of them and put them in a vase in the dining room. Lena immediately tried to smell them and got a petal on her nose, and was very proud of this. Ashford watched her from across the table. He had a new routine now. Mornings at the table. Afternoons at his desk. Sometimes, in the late afternoon when the light was good, he went to the garden. He sat by the bench and the fountain, and sometimes he talked, quietly, to the name on the plaque. And sometimes Lena came and sat on the ground beside his wheelchair and told rabbit stories, and he listened to those too. Laura still arrived at 6:47. Still cleaned the East Wing first. But now, when she passed the study, the door was open. And sometimes, from inside, she could hear him on the phone actually talking, not just answering, and the sound of it, the simple sound of a human voice in a room that had been silent for so long, felt like something being given back. There is a version of family that doesn't require blood or paperwork. It requires only showing up. Stubbornly. Repeatedly. With a stuffed rabbit and no concept of the word impossible. This story doesn't end with a bow tied on it. Real ones never do. But in that house, in that summer, with the rose bushes blooming and the garden door unlocked and a little girl laughing somewhere down the hall, it felt, finally, like something beginning. And that's the kind of story we'll always be here to tell.